Not so long ago, I did a video covering the Panasonic S1H and why I thought it was a very important camera. If you want to check that video out, you could do so via the card and in the description. And just last week, Panasonic invited myself, my wife, and a whole bunch of other filmmakers out to Los Angeles to get our hands on this camera and to actually see it in use and get some specs. So in this video, we're going to be talking about this camera, my thoughts after actually filming with it, and where I think it fits in this weird world we're in and kind of this new age when it comes to these small cinema cameras. I only had about an hour with the camera, but I did film a whole bunch of footage, including some anamorphic stuff, which we'll take a look at. But I do need to state that this is all pre-production stuff that you're going to be seeing in this review and not necessarily the final image quality you can expect. So I'm going to start by saying this camera really surprised me. And the big takeaway for me from the event and actually using the camera is that it is way more than I expected. So originally I thought the S1H was going to be a Panasonic S1 with some added video features, but nothing insane. This camera, however, is completely different. It is in one way a Panasonic S1. If you're going to be shooting stills on this thing, really the only difference is going to be the anti-alias filter that is over the sensor. Otherwise, you have a fully fledged Panasonic S1 in the S1H. But Panasonic added a ton of features. Obviously, there's the big ticket items like 6K, multi-aspect ratio, and others. But if you go into the menu system of the Panasonic S1H, they added so much. It really is a completely different camera. So I could spend 15 minutes talking about all the little stuff Panasonic added, but I want to hit the big bullet points and then get to, what I think of this camera for $4,000. So obviously the body is larger. It has a completely different design when it comes to the screen, which I absolutely love. It is both like the S1 here, where it tilts up, but it also flips out, and it lets you kind of do a hybrid of the two so that you can have a tilty, flippy, outy screen that doesn't block your ports. There's also a fan built into this camera with an intake and output on the sides of the screen and behind the screen, and this will allow you to record unlimited at any mode in this camera. Going along with that theme of unlimited recording, the camera has two SD card slots using UHS 2 slots, and they're actually hot swappable. So in theory, you really could indefinitely record on the S1H if you have enough power. When it comes to recording video on the S1H, there are a total of 26 combinations that will let you customize the following specs when it comes to your video. And this include resolution, frame rate, sensor crop, aspect ratio, chroma, color bit depth, codec and compression method, and more. Now, there are a gazillion settings in the camera, but what I love that Panasonic did with the S1H is they give you a way to filter it all out. So with that menu item, you can essentially create your own set of settings and not have to deal with the mind-boggling amount of options on this guy. So special shout out to Matt Allard over at New Shooter for giving me that tip, and you should definitely check out their article on the S1H. It is a phenomenal read. Thanks to the multi-aspect ratio sensor on this camera, we are able to record in several different aspect ratios, including 16:9, 4:3, 3:2, in resolutions of 6K, 5.9K, 5.4K, UHD 4K, and DCI 4K, as well as HD. Each resolution has a limit on the frame rate you are able to use, and some of these modes force you to use the Super 35 crop mode on the camera. The point is, this camera has so many different options, giving you insane amounts of flexibility depending on what you're trying to capture. My favorite feature is by far the 6K record modes. And keep in mind that 6K is captured at 200 megabits a second, which you could argue it'd be nice to have higher data rates for that much resolution. But the nice thing is you can record lots of 6K on this camera on simple SD cards, and you're able to record more. Being able to reframe that 6K is really handy, whether you're using the 5.9 16:9 aspect ratio files or using the open gate mode, which is 6K at 3:2 for your aspect ratio. So you can really do just about anything when it comes to framing, and it was really fun to use a 6K camera for the first time and have that much resolution to play with. If you're more of a high frame rate type of guy or gal, this camera also has you covered. You can record up to 120 frames native in this camera at HD. You also can go up to 180 frames per second using their variable frame rate mode, which will slow things down in the camera. And in these high frame rate modes, you do have manual exposure, unlike the S1. Now, if you just want a solid 4K image, you can totally do that and switch over to Cinema 4K or DCI or UHD and get 400 megabits all eye and all that good stuff. Something else very exciting about this camera is we will be seeing RAW when it comes to the HDMI output, combination of work from Panasonic and Atomos. So looking forward to hearing more about that. At this point, there's really not a lot of information. And then there's the big one for me, anamorphic on this camera. This camera, and I keep pointing to the S1, but the S1H has insane capabilities when it comes to anamorphic. Not only does it have dedicated anamorphic modes, but there are a ton of assist features. You can de-squeeze the image. There's also crop guide marks. And finally, you have image stabilization specifically designed for anamorphic. Several different modes, and it covers any anamorphic and even anamorphic de-squeezes I've never heard of. So when I got this camera, I spent about 20 minutes of my hour and a half trying to let somebody get me one of those anamorphic lenses they had at the event and allow me to take it outside. So special thanks to those who helped me out. You know who you are. And I was able to get the Atlas 50mm T2, take it outdoors and film with the S1H. And I absolutely fell in love with that setup. I completely shot everything handheld using image stabilization and de-squeezing on the rear of the camera using the actual screen, and it was really a dream to work with. Focus was a little difficult because anamorphic on such a small display is tough, but I was really happy with the results, and even stabilization while walking was really impressive. So as an example, here is a shot of me walking handheld with the camera. I didn't try to soft step, I just started walking and pointing the camera forward, and I think the results are great. So if you're one of those soft stepping Steadicam types, you're gonna be able to do a lot with this camera and anamorphic. And of course, that stabilization trickles down to all the other modes on this camera. It is really impressive that we have a full frame camera with such good stabilization, and it works with all the different modes on this camera. There's still more to talk about with this camera. We have dual native ISO. That means in daylight, harsh environments, as well as low light, you have 2 native ISOs to choose from, which is amazing. This camera also has V-Log with V-Gamut, and that looks amazing on this camera. Really easy to push the files around in post. And then there's tons of other stuff that I don't have time to talk about that they've added to this camera. So what's the deal with this guy, and what is the competition, and is this camera worth $4,000? The last question there, I think the answer is yes. $4,000 is pretty amazing to me, considering what all is in this thing and what you'll be able to do down the road. A full frame 4K RAW capable camera that can do 6K anamorphic and has high frame rate options with image stabilization built in is incredible. And keep in mind, this is an all-in-one option. So you have everything you need, great battery life, stabilization. Really the only thing missing from the S1H, in my opinion, is built-in ND or some way to have ND that isn't on the front of your camera lens. So when it comes to competition, if you're gonna be dropping that kind of coin on a camera, there are other options to consider, and that this camera, or the S1H, is going to be competing against. One very interesting alternative is the Canon C200B. So this camera has built-in ND, shoots 4K, has RAW capabilities, and is about $1,000 more. It's very popular amongst shooters, and this camera is going up against it. So a very interesting alternative, but it is lacking an EVF in that B configuration, doesn't have in-body image stabilization, and of course it doesn't have a full frame sensor. Of course, we can't talk about this camera without talking about the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, almost said 4K there, which can do 6K as well, but it has limitations when it comes to its 4K options, and it's not very ergonomically sound. So the S1H, you can just go out and shoot. It has everything you need. You don't really even need to add much, whereas the Pocket 6K is going to require a lot more to kind of complete that package. But it's around $1,500 cheaper, and it has RAW internal using the amazing new Blackmagic RAW codec. Finally, there's the S1, which is around $1,500 cheaper. It's missing a lot of those options, but it's a solid 4K camera, and it also has that full frame sensor. And last, there is the unicorn camera, the Sony a7S III, which is yet to be talked about much, and it might be named something different in the end, but that camera is most likely going to match or come close to the S1H, and that's another alternative to consider. At the end of the day, if I wasn't running this YouTube channel and was back doing my old corporate documentary film job, I would probably own an S1H, and that would be my daily driver, you know, for a sub $5,000 camera. I wish it was a little more affordable, but at $4,000, I do think it's worth what all you're getting. The main problems I have with this camera is, number one, this isn't a true full frame 4K 60 camera like Panasonic's been kind of talking about. It's a full frame camera that can do 4K 60, but you will have a crop and you aren't going to get full frame. So we're still waiting for that camera that can do full frame 4K 60, but we're not quite there yet. The other thing I didn't like about the S1H was actually not the S1H's problem, but the S1. So the way this works is if you look at the S1H, you're like, wow, this is too expensive. Panasonic's like, hey, we've got the S1. And it is a great alternative for those like us and me who really don't need full frame, you know, 6K capabilities. But they crippled something on this camera, which very much upset me. So the S1 can't do high frame rates with manual exposure. If you try to shoot at 120 or 180 frames per second, you have to use auto exposure. And that really bugs me. This is a very Canon move that Panasonic has done with the S1, and I just don't think it's necessary. Now I understand you have to separate high-end and low-end cameras. You can't have their feature set too close together. But in my opinion, the S1H has so much more going for it. That was kind of a low ball move. So Panasonic, if you're watching, can we change that? Can we add manual exposure to the high frame rate options on the S1? I think that would be kind of the perfect tier level. You got the S1 if you don't want to spend $4,000, and then when you're ready to jump up, the S1H is ready to rock and roll. So I hope you enjoyed this video covering the S1H. I will be doing a full review when the camera comes out and a guide on it. I'm working right now on the S1 guide, so you can check that out in the near future. That's gonna wrap this video up for me, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.